Welcome to History in the Highway, the podcast version. I'm your host, Stan Ellsworth, and you're riding on West Star Media. Hey, this is an opportunity for us to talk about lots of things. Things that are technological in nature, things that are historic in nature, maybe even blend the two. Throughout history, there's been some big moments, like the discovery or invention of fire, the invention of the wheel, the invention of the distilling of grain, the making of beer, and a number of other things. Some things have changed the world, and one of those is the invention of heavier-than-air flight. And we credit that to the Wright brothers, two boys from Dayton, Ohio. Now, to put them in time and place, the Wright brothers happened at the end of the 19th century. We'll talk throughout our piece here about what was going on, what was happening in the world, what was happening in America, and how the Wright brothers' discovery made a difference. These two brothers went through a lot to get where they got to. They started out as high school dropouts. And they ended up as world-famous pioneers of a new technology. They changed the world. They took us off the ground, into the heavens, and onto the moon. We'll be right back with the story of the Wright Stuff. Now, this all begins in Dayton, Ohio in 1878. So what's going on in the world? What's happening? Look, baseball is just barely becoming the national pastime. The Transcontinental Railroad has just years before connected our nation from coast to coast. And Sitting Bull and the Lakota Nation have just trounced Custer out at the Little Bighorn. Now, onto this scene of chaos, we're going to return to the heart of civilization, Dayton, Ohio, and those two young men, Wilbur and Orville Wright. Their father is a minister in the United Brethren of Christ Church. And while the Right Reverend Wright is out making his rounds, he returns home and brings the boys a toy that really is the beginning of their investigation of flight. Now, the toy is based on a flying machine that was created by the French aeronaut Alphonse Pénaud, and what it really looks like is a little helicopter. You twist the propeller, tightens up the rubber band, and then you let go, and whoa, the kids are amazed. Actually, the Wright brothers were amazed. They were gobsmacked by this toy. And then they reinvented it. And time and again, they would reinvent this toy, and they would improve upon it. And it's this little whirlybird toy that actually whetted their appetite to study flight. Now, it would be years before they'd really be able to begin that investigation. But the Wright brothers' minds were aflame with the possibility that man could fly. Now, the Wright brothers' studies were kind of limited to high school. Now, Wilbur Wright, during the winter break, he got hit in the face with a hockey stick. He lost most of his front teeth, and he was on bed rest for a while. He never really recovered from that. It took him a year. And back then, you didn't have to have your ACT, your SAT, and your admission form. So while Wilbur never officially finished high school, he did have a year of collegiate study. Orville, on the other hand, was just a more adventurous youth, let's say. And he was courteously asked by the principal of his school to excuse himself from further opportunity. Really, the kid was wild and a little bit of a troublemaker. He just had more fun than the average boy. So these two guys explode on the business scene together. They're going to develop a print shop, and they're going to be the guys that print several of the newspapers in Dayton. Okay? They're running the world, man. They've got newspapers for each interest. And finally, in the middle of the 1880s, a new craze sweeps the nation: the bicycle. See, the bicycle design has changed. Originally, some of you may remember this, some of you might be old enough to have ridden one. The bicycle was designed with a huge front tire and a small rear tire. But with the development in the 1880s of what's called the safety bike, where the front and rear tire are the same size, everybody could do it. So now with the invention of the safety bike, it wasn't so much a question of acrobatics. It was now just a question of maintaining balance and velocity. And the Wright brothers would excel at this bicycling phenomenon. They opened a shop called the Wright Brothers Bicycle Exchange. You could bring yours in and trade for another. You could buy one of theirs. You know, some of the ones that were damaged beyond repair, Orville would fix, and he'd make them better. The Wright brothers began their own brand of bicycles, the Wright Bike. Get it? Pretty good advertising even today. Come on in and buy yourself the Wright Bike. Okay, so they were making good money. They found themselves comfortable enough to now devote themselves to the study of flight. So let's fast forward 20 years from the gift of the toy. We're now at the end of the 19th century. Let's look at the technologies of the day. We have a steel navy. We've learned how to float an iron boat. Okay, the steam locomotive is now crisscrossing the nation at speed. The telegraph is everywhere. The telephone, a new technology, is taking over for the telegraph. You can pick up the phone and call San Francisco from Washington, D.C. Okay, frankly, the telephone and barbed wire closed down the American West. There is no more wild frontier. So what are two wild, outlaw-spirited young men from Dayton to do? You can't go ride the plains. But what can you do? You can ride the air. Ain't nobody barbed wired that yet. Now let's look at this. Wilbur has this mind that's driven. Gotta conceive how to fly. He writes to everyone he can that's in the field. One of the people that he becomes the most close to is a French railroad engineer who is as addicted to this thing as Wilbur is. His name is Octavio Newton. And he writes to Octave, one of the first letters he writes is, I fear that my disease, that's what he called his need to investigate flight. He said, I fear that my disease will cost me my fortune and my life. Now, Chanute was as addicted as Wilbur was. And these two guys kind of had a lifelong correspondence. In fact, Chanute would come to their experimental stations almost every year. But he and Chanute worked on designs. They worked on drawings. They worked on theories. And it would be these theories that would drag Orville into the mix. You see, Orville was much more of a technological mind. Today you might say he's the nerd. But Orville saw the world as 1, 2, 3, ABC. You know, there's got to be a way to fit this together. Let's look at it mechanically. Well, Wilbur had that driven personality, the people person. He was the business mind. But it's these theories that are going to propel the Wright brothers above and beyond anyone else. Remember, people had been gliding now for about 10 years. Okay, there were guys in France. One of the best glider pilots on earth was a fellow named Otto Lilienthal from Germany. And, you know, the Wright brothers were investigating and studying his equations. You see, everybody was working on this equation. How do you get off the ground? The question of lift. But Wilbur perceived that the equation wasn't just about lift. It was a three-factored equation. It's forward and backwards, side to side, and up and down. And the way Wilbur answered this question was by observing the natural world. You know, you can learn a lot just by sitting quiet and watching. Wilbur was watching birds because they can fly. And he made two, to him, profound observations. Number one, a bird's wing is cambered, okay, meaning it's arched. Now, other people had observed this. They'd seen that, and their wings had actually been arched. But Wilbur wondered why. As air passes over the wing, the air pressure under becomes stronger than the air pressure over, and it naturally lifts. He also saw that the birds use their pinion feathers, the feathers out on the end of their wing. They flip them, they trim them. Okay, they widen them, they flex them and contract them, and that's how they achieve turns and twists in the air. And Wilbur thought of this technology that now we call wing warping. He experimented by twisting a long box, and he perceived that if you twist a wing one way, you can turn, and if you twist a wing the other way, you can turn the opposite way. He thought of it kind of like riding a bicycle. You know, when you're riding a bike or a motorcycle, I love motorcycles, as you know, Okay, when you're on the bike, if you want to turn to the left, you lean left. If you want to turn to the right, you lean right. Most people of the day were still thinking of steering in the air like steering on water. And that just won't work. We'll be right back. So Wilbur has looked at this three-part equation, and he believes that he's starting to find the answers. Now, the Wright brothers, together now, are going to experiment in Ohio with kites and gliders. It's fun with fabric and light wood. So they're out in the field, they're testing designs, seeing which one goes best. Okay, and they come to some conclusions. Wilbur feels that the time is right. He's going to write to the Smithsonian. He's going to write to the National Meteorological Society, the guys that run the wind and the rain stuff. He asked the Smithsonian for everything they've got on flight. So the gurus of rain and wind write back to Wilbur and say, hey, you got three options. Number 1, California. Number 2, Florida. And number 3, the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Well, quickly looking at a map, you can see which one is in proximity to Dayton, Ohio. The Outer Banks of North Carolina. So off to Kitty Hawk the Wright brothers go. In 1901, the Wright brothers show up at Kitty Hawk, and they've got their big glider. Now, this glider, it's got, the right wings ready to warp, good box build. They like that double-decker, wing opportunity, gives them the right amount of lift. But to stabilize the aircraft, they've put this plane out in front. It's a surface. They call it a canard because it looks like a duck's head way out in front of the wings. And that canard is supposed to stabilize the aircraft while the wings are warped to turn. Sadly, the first time they try to fly it, it goes straight up, comes straight down. The aircraft is damaged. So damaged that they take a lot of time to fix it, and really the good flying weather's gone. They have to go back and investigate what has happened. What are the numbers telling us? What are the wind numbers that we already have, and the little bit of information we've been able to gather, what does it tell us? So the Wright brothers build their own wind tunnel back at the bicycle shop. And they're going to test their theories and test their numbers. And what they learn is that they need bigger wings, longer wings, wider wings, creating more lift and more ability to turn. They need to add stability. And that rudder that they put behind the aircraft is going to lengthen the body. It adds weight, but because of the wider wings, they're going to be able to carry more weight. When they come back to Kitty Hawk, they think they've got a glider where a human being can actually control that thing and get good time in air. The year is 1903. What's going on in the world? Well, President McKinley was assassinated. Theodore Roosevelt is now the president of the United States, and he's sending the Navy all over the world to impress people that the United States is a player. And up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Harley-Davidson is just about to open its doors. But what about our boys here in Dayton, Ohio? What are they up to? They're finding a way to put that motor on their airplane to make possible that heavier-than-air flight. Up till now, they've been flying spruce and canvas. Now they're about to put real weight, I'm talking pounds, on that airplane. They got to find a way. Now, they come up with several answers on this motor. How are they going to make it happen? Okay, number one, they don't need a carburetor. All they need is an air vent. They're flying. They're moving through the air. The air will naturally be drawn in, so the carburation is very crude. They don't need a fuel pump, so minus that poundage, they're going to use gravity. They'll put the gas tank up on the top wing, and then through a tube, the fuel will be introduced to the engine, and then mixed with the air, okay, without the carburetor, more pounds saved, and go straight into the chambers. But the engine itself will be cast of aluminum. Aluminum is much lighter than iron or steel. Now, most people of the day thought that that'll never work. The aluminum couldn't possibly hold up under the stress of that heat and pressure. Well, we'll see. If you look at the model of the Wright Flyer, you'll see that much of it resembles a bicycle. They've got the sprockets on the back to drive the propellers. Looks like you're flying a 10-speed. And the propellers were made of the lightest wood that was still strong enough. And they were cut to the Wright brothers' specific proportions. They packed up the whole kit and caboodle and headed down to Kitty Hawk. Would it work? Would it crash and burn? Literally now that was a possibility. Gasoline has been introduced to the equation. It was on December the 17th that they rolled the Wright Flyer out for its initiation into the air. Who would fly it first was decided by a coin toss. But when the winds weren't favorable on Wilbur's first attempt, he won that toss. The next flight went to Orville. And at 10:35 a.m., Orville took off into the North Carolina skies. The flight may have lasted all of 12 seconds, and it only covered about 120 feet, but it had been done. Heavier than air flight had been accomplished. The Wright brothers and their crew were ecstatic. They celebrated. They took 3 more flights that day. Wilbur, Orville, longer than the first, longer than the second. And finally, the last flight of the day, Wilbur's final flight in December. Over 450 feet, almost a minute in the air. It had been done. It had truly been done. The Wright brothers were masters of the sky. The first men to accomplish heavier than air flight. Well, after that 4th flight, it was time to whoop it up. They went in their little shack, baby pop a top or two. Sadly, nobody thought to rope down the aircraft, and when a strong wind blew up, Wright Flyer 1 was flipped over on her back, and even without a guy in it, she crashed and burned. But they partied on undiminished. The next morning, they were headed out of town. They sent to their daddy back home a telegram, and it said basically, "Success, we did it. Alert the press, we'll be home for Christmas." And just like that, the world had been changed forever. So what's the legacy of the Wright brothers? Well, right off the bat, let's look at the technologies that they created. Number one, they were right about that engine. Apparently you can cast aluminum, and it will work. They were right about rudimentary carburation. But the real magic, the technological miracle, was that tri-axle control. That's the thing for which they were really world famous. Yes, they had accomplished heavier than air flight. They were celebrated. They were treated like royalty in 25 European nations. And when they came home, the President of the United States awarded them a gold medal. Congress celebrated them. Wilbur Wright would die in 1911 from typhoid fever. But Orville Wright would live long enough to see transcontinental flight. He saw Charles Lindbergh cross the Atlantic. He saw people fly around the globe. He lived long enough to see Chuck Yeager break the speed of sound.
The historic plane, the XS-1, earned the resting place.
The Wright brothers did change the world. And they lived the American dream. It was Wilbur's drive, his never-say-die attitude, and Orville's uncompromising mechanical curiosity that really made that magic happen. But it was the human element that made the difference. These guys went as far as their own drive, their own ambition, their own vision could take them. And for the Wright brothers, it took them and us into the stars. See you next time on History in the Highway.